It's so beautiful just to be in this room together and to look out and to see so many familiar faces. Jacqueline was just commenting. It's almost like family in this room. And if it feels comfortable for those who actually saw cold plus ice, I invite you to close your eyes for one moment. Consider where you find yourself after walking out. What did you experience, and what are you feeling right now? Hopelessness? Perhaps a sense of hope? Despondency? Determination? Consider other moments in your life. Do you remember a moment when you came across an experience, a model, or a person that wasn't just an aha moment, but actually changed the trajectory of how you viewed the world from that moment on? You can open your eyes now. That was my encounter with Acumen, the organization that connected me to the two remarkable women on this stage, Jacqueline Novogratz and Steph Speirs. Decades ago, early in my path, I built latrines in Mexico and was combating child prostitution in Southeast Asia, speaking with headmen in villages, trying to convince them of the business case of putting children into vocational training rather than into brothels. To contribute more economically, the thought was, how do you actually convince people to avoid and not sell these children into prostitution? So I was working and building one latrine, fighting to help one child at a time. I wished in my mind that a creative solution existed that could use opportunity as a tool to combat the most intractable problems of poverty. Fast forward over a decade later, I'm introduced to the work of Acumen and see here's an opportunity to work not just one situation at a time, but setting up the intricacies and the building blocks of what's necessary for true systems change. I remember Jacqueline had a talk here at the Asia Society, and it was just, she walked in with her then board chair, Margot Alexander, and the room was overflowing with people, and people were just trying to hear what she had to say. And in that talk, she went step by step, going through the complex layers of water treatment, sanitation, even crossbreeding of cattle, housing, solar, explaining why markets and aid were really falling short in Pakistan, the country of my birth. She gave examples of companies. Acumen was investing in entrepreneurs. They accompanied entrepreneurs, the people. From that talk, I could see Acumen is a laboratory, going deep into the life cycle of what it means to build a company, excavating the layers and layers of failure within systems by listening directly to the voices unheard, the customers, the poor, through storytelling, human-centered design, and ultimately allowing those voices to lead the design of the businesses that would impact them. Jacqueline and a group of advisors who became Acumen's founding board put into words and practice the kind of work I longed to see when I lived in Asia, deeply rooted in moral leadership, in risk-taking, investing as a means never an end, a commitment to inquiry, to entering with questions, not answers, and embracing failure as a necessary component of breaking the shackles of poverty. So Acumen to me was like a prayer come to life. I was lucky enough to encounter this rising, shining star in Steph Speirs, another entrepreneur who dared to go where markets were failing. She was working in the United States government in Yemen. She saw firsthand how the geopolitics of oil were broken, how new solutions like renewable energy were not entering the conversation. So in 2013, she packed up her bags and went to Pakistan to work on the renewable energy portfolio as an intern at Acumen. Later, I remember when she applied to be an Acumen Global Fellow. I remember she was impressive. And her dissection of questions, her vision, her voice, it was obvious she was someone to watch. So much of the theme and mission of this institution, the Asia Society, runs parallel to Acumen and Steph's work. It's possibility, reimagination, access, freedom, dignity, choice, and change. An exhibit like Coal plus Ice leaves no doubt of the need to reimagine. What is the future of the world, and how will it be? I wouldn't actually be able to count the number of times that I visited the Asia Society and even this room for life-changing programming. The connection to art, theory, heart, and practice. And how fortunate are we to all be in this room tonight? An auditorium filled with people who are socializing hope and offering real tools and models for change. Not only on the stage, but the audience as well. There are people like Anna Porzykonski, I think she's sitting around there, who's from the Museum of Natural History Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. And they use data and science and fact to create policy changes around the world. They're leaders and students from the Tamer Institute for Social Enterprise and Climate Change from the Columbia Business School. And there's so many other voices in the room. So when we get to Q&A, please speak up and make sure your voice is heard. And all of that is to say there are deep, deep roots and deep connections on the stage and in this room, and how special it is to be with these women and to allow for uncorrelated, uncommon, and even confusing connections to enter and still enrich the conversation. This is the kind of thinking that really allows innovation to flourish and breathes hope into discussion around the real opportunity of entrepreneurship at that nexus of climate change and poverty. So Jacqueline and Steph, here we are, and whether it was the Chinese cutting and storing ice as a means of preserving food in 1000 BC, or people dating back thousands of years using coal as a source of heat and energy, coal and ice are two examples how time and again entrepreneurs have found solutions to hard-to-solve problems, and how these solutions come with unintended consequences. Susan Meiselas, an advisor to Acumen, and also, as you heard, the co-curator of Coal plus Ice, talks about asking herself a question when she was first invited to go to China to see the coal mines and consider what was happening there. She asked, what would I have to offer? A beautifully focusing question, one we might all benefit from asking ourselves. In a moment where so many actors, governments, corporations, the general public, are discussing climate, how might you answer the question, what do I have to offer? So Jacqueline, let's begin with thinking about your trajectory and then thinking about what Acumen has to offer before we move on. Thank you.
First of all, can we just recognize how beautiful those words just were? My partner in crime over here for many years, thank you. That was really beautiful. And Orville and Susan, this is spectacular. And your dream and your desire to find ways to show both the destruction and the possibility of what the human experience is doing to our Earth is extraordinary. And Susan, I don't think I've learned more about immersion from another human being than you. And so it has been 30 years. I hate to break it to you, but you've shaped me and Acumen in so many ways. So it's just wonderful to be here. And then finally, to what Shaiza said, Steph, you you represent the next generation in so many glorious ways, but so many people in this room do get to what do we all have to offer. In a way, when I think of that question, what do I have to offer, I go back to when I was a 25-year-old, because I think that's so relevant. I saw some students walking in. I think it's so relevant in this moment where our problems feel so big and so many people feel so small and sometimes so helpless. When I think back to when I was 25, I had all of $600 in my bank account. I had been a banker for all of 3 years. I didn't really know anything about the African continent, but I did have this dream that I would somehow help solve poverty. And it's kind of crazy to look back. And I guess what I had was the ability to see possibility everywhere. And through the enthusiasm that I brought, I had the ability to get other people to see possibility and then to start working on it. And that's pretty much all I had. I didn't know how to build a bank. I didn't know Rwanda. I didn't know the culture. But I knew I loved people. I knew I saw the amazingness of people if they could see it in themselves. And I knew that I could work really, really hard. And every single person who's here has all of that. So I was lucky because I got to see in the first 3 years that you could actually build something. Then life would teach me how hard it actually was to build something that could really make change. It taught me all the obstacles, the hardships, the tragedies and the heartbreaks, but it was a good thing I didn't know all that stuff. Now, when I look 35 years later, what Acumen has to bring is entirely different, but at the core of it is that same sense of seeing possibility where others see despair, a willingness to try, but we sit on enormous resources, financial and human. We sit on social capital, our connections, our reputation, our ability to open doors, and all of that rests on an incredible community that includes some of the most powerful people in the world and some who the world would see as the least powerful people in the world, and all of them matter. And just seeing some of you walk in tonight has really filled me with this sense of incredible gratitude, because the community is so diverse in the way that we've tackled big problems of poverty. And so I'll stop there, and if you have no idea what Acumen does, I'll say that later. But that's what I feel that I now have to bring. But what I'm moved more by is that when I had, by all definitions, nothing to bring, I still had something to bring.
Yeah, growing up without money, my mom used to say that you always have your time, and time is actually our scarcest resource, and everyone has something to bring to the climate change fight, because it's an all hands on deck problem. And what coal and ice teaches us is that we have to imagine climate change as a problem that extends beyond our lifetime, and we have to remember that what happens across the world affects the air we breathe today, and we are all interconnected. And yet, right now is a really terrible time in the world that people feel in their soul. They feel it. We're a more divided world than we have ever been. Studies show that people are more isolated and suicidal than they've ever been. And yet, the balm for all of that and the salve for all of that has always been community. And this is something that Acumen does really, really well. They've trained entrepreneurs all across the world, including myself, and really trying to imagine a future that doesn't exist yet, which is what entrepreneurship is. Entrepreneurship is trying to design a future that doesn't exist yet. So we started a company called Solstice, which in 2015, before the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the United States, before investors would even believe it was possible, we set out to try to serve low-income customers with clean energy in America. And today, 50% of our customers are low income, which exceeds the percentage of low income households in America, which is around 40%. 40% of this country is living on a household income of $40,000 or less. And we are able to save households $3 million a year on their electricity bills, and we have shared 1.3 million of our revenue with local communities to share our revenues in local communities. And all of that was possible only because we could do it together. It was impossible to do it alone. And so what we can bring is this belief that this future that we can't see yet is infinitely possible, but only if we are able to get other people to join the mission, like Jacqueline and Shaiza has done for many years now.
Thanks, Steph. It's interesting. We had a conversation last week where you really discussed viewing risk differently. And perhaps it was how you were raised or your mother or different reasons, but you were saying there's this incredible opportunity where there's risk arbitrage in the world. And I appreciated that you thought that perhaps Solstice could work because you saw something that was less risky than other people could actually see. And I really feel you did too, Jacqueline, in some ways, where people would be afraid at points when you would say, well, that makes perfect sense. And I feel in the investment world, in growth investing also, oftentimes people don't want to take a risk because it just makes so much more sense to preserve. But as you can see in Coal Plus Ice, I mean, the first exhibition my father took us to when we immigrated to America was at the museum, at the Science and Industry Museum. And it's a coal chute you go down, and you experience coal there. And I remember he said, this is how the energy in this country is made. And I went down there, and I was just so claustrophobic, and I felt so upset afterwards. And I think I just got rid of that memory till I walked into the show, and I'm like, oh, I remember this. And, you know, I married a man whose grandfather was a coal miner in Pennsylvania. And that was so far from my background. So we are getting places, thinking about the risk and the arbitrage. And what, you know, I'd like both of you to really think about that with your organizations.
Why don't you start?
Risk is really comes down to discerning what is impossible versus what is improbable. And so many people conflate those two things. They think that if it seems improbable, then it's likely impossible. So in a very tangible example, a lot of the clean energy projects that are built in America don't allow low-income households to participate because they're seen as too risky. They're seen as unlikely to pay their electricity bills, and we'd rather just sell solar or wind power to high-income people who we know will definitely afford it. And little known fact, in America, your FICO score is used to qualify you to see if you can buy solar power. And FICO scores were invented in 1956 as an objective measure of our credit worthiness, but they're not objective. They don't measure your cell phone history, your rental history, your utility bill history, which arguably is more relevant to whether you're going to pay your bills on time. And nearly 60% of the country doesn't have the right FICO credit score to get access to solar in this country. And yet, if you have grown up with scarcity of money, you know that your utility bill is one of the last bills that you'll stop paying. And it's that insight that allowed us to create a new score called the Energy Score. And we created this machine learning algorithm that predicts whether people will pay their utility bills on time based on their utility repayment history and other demographic data that's not taken into account with your FICO credit scores. And we showed that even though FICO credit scores exclude almost 60% of the country, our energy score increases the number of people that can benefit from solar by 14%. And it showed that people may have a low credit score, but they can still pay their utility bills on time. And so, FICO credit scores are a modern form of exclusion like redlining, but we can rewrite that history with better data. We can recalculate the risk that people are seeing in a dismissive way and create a future in which clean energy works for more people.
So, well, first, what does Acumen do? And in a way, we also went into the risk arbitrage business by recognizing that markets see the poor, as Steph said, as too risky. Charities, on the other hand, often have the subterfuge of thinking that they are avoiding risk by not believing that there's failure. And so there's not an accountability on, did you actually solve the problem? And so Acumen tried to hold the two. So much of what we do is holding values in tension. We start with the belief that entrepreneurial builders are those who see possibility where others see impossibility. And so it starts with the individual, and that's, Steph talked about herself being an entrepreneur and an Acumen fellow. Acumen Academy is our school for social change, grounded in the ideas of moral leadership, which start with immersion. We have 1,650 fellows, and about 1 million people have taken our online courses. Some of those individuals go on to the big part of the visible work that Acumen does, which is ventures. We invest in entrepreneurs with patient capital for anywhere from 10 to 20 years, so that entrepreneurs like Steph can build from the perspective of the people they are trying to serve, put the right kind of capital in place, as you heard from Steph, understand the proxies to allow people access to markets that it may not have been accessible to them. Use our social capital as well as our financial capital, and then any money that comes back gets reinvested. In short, under the investing work in the next 18 months, we will have under management about $1 billion. Interestingly for us, about 800 million of those dollars will be under the for-profit management company that Acumen now runs. But this is not a management company at business as usual. The older we get, the more radical we get in terms of understanding that we have to think differently about what risk actually is. We have to structure the right kind of capital connected to the right kind of character to make real change, so that as we confront the climate crisis, so are we ensuring a just transition. So are we ensuring those people who are too often overlooked and underestimated are included. An example that takes you through those two pieces and then goes into the work we do on partnerships and insights is in the off-grid electrification business, which is where Steph works in the United States. Our work has been, in that part of the work that we do, primarily global. 2007, 1.5 billion people had no access to electricity. Two young guys had this vision that they could eradicate kerosene, which is highly polluting, dangerous, and expensive. They were crazy, but they had the determination, the character, and the willingness to at least try, so we bet on them. It's been a 17-year bet, but through our patient capital investing and then for-profit investing, that company, D-Light, where Steph was a fellow, has brought off-grid solar electrification to 150 million people. It brought us on a journey where we then could invest in 40 other companies in the off-grid solar, because then we started to see that we were helping to build an overall ecosystem that was anti-fragile, that would help people get access to electrification in a moment of the world that is so divided that we are okay with 1 in 5 human beings on the planet not having any access whatsoever. And once we hit 230 million people through those 40 companies, we started to ask ourselves a question that we should all be asking ourselves. If one small nonprofit through their portfolio of 40 companies could enable 230 million people to get access to off-grid solar electricity, not only saving the emissions from kerosene, but ensuring a future aversion of carbon emissions, then why can't we reach the other 700 million people on the planet who still have no access to electricity? This is where real risk comes in. We put together a facility that is unapologetic about where we need philanthropy, $60 million, so that we could get companies into countries like Malawi with a 14% electrification rate, Chad with a 4% electrification rate, Guinea 9%, Liberia 11%. If we want a world that is fully interdependent, where people can have more dignity and solve their own problems, they need electricity. But the markets aren't going to go into these nations. And indeed, when I went to one of the biggest development finance institutions in the world, who had rejected our proposal, I at least had the good grace of the CEO who was willing to talk to me. And I said, I'm really sort of confused as to why you wouldn't have put money into this facility that is so important and no one else is trying it. And he said, Jacqueline, let's be honest, you understand the markets, you understand investments. Africa, writ large, is, and the places you're going are the riskiest places on earth to invest. And there's a rule in finance: high risk, high financial return. There's no way we're going in unless we have a high financial return, and the return that you're offering is so low as to be laughable. And I said, with all respect, if that's the way that we make our decisions for almost 1 billion people on the planet, we're never going to solve the problem. Yes, this is risky, but in that risk lies enormous opportunity to unlock. Enormous possibility if we actually have the courage to invest our money with a sense of reimagining what real investment could release. If it's just money earned, whether we destroy environments, destroy people's employment, well, I don't want it. But if real investing and real risk-taking could be measured by the amount of beauty created, by the amount of jobs created, by the amount of possibility enabled, well, we'd have a very different world. And so for me, risk is actually what we have to lean into, because risk is where the whole world of possibility is apparent, is possible, and is within our reach.
And we miscalculate risk when a tree only has value when you cut it down. And the way that we evaluate value in this world is not taking into account all the ways that are not in a financial model. And yet there are businesses that are trying to forge this future in climate. So I'm curious if either of you has thoughts on how do we contend with that the financial world isn't capturing the full value of our climate system, and yet there are businesses that are trying to forge that future.
What's so exciting to me, and I actually am one of the truly hopeful people right now, because I get to work with entrepreneurs and investors like you, who are willing to go there, is that we're seeing at the edges of capitalism almost a renaissance in the way that we're thinking and looking for new financial instruments. And so one is more controversial in the carbon markets, but the interesting thing about the carbon markets is that it's one of the first markets that are actually putting a value on the carbon that is offset, so that we can show a company like a cook stove company that we have, it's called Burn, but a cook stove is, imagine just like a little pot that you put wood into, or charcoal, which is made from wood. And that's how women cook. There are 3.5 billion cook stoves in the world. It emits as much carbon as an industry as all of aviation or all of shipping. So it's a big deal, but the world hasn't paid attention to it because it's very, very poor people. And so we invested in an entrepreneur named Peter Scott, and he created a cook stove company that reduced reduced charcoal and wood utilization by 60%. That's a lot of trees that aren't cut down by a lot of very, very poor women. And so the company struggled for many years because we are still looking at tiny, tiny margins. But when the voluntary carbon markets became accessible to a guy like Peter Scott, he was able to sell a $40 cook stove for $3. And then it was game on. And we saw him take probably 11 years to sell 1 million stoves. And last year he sold another 1 million stoves. That's a lot of trees. So far he's saved about 20 million trees, created 2,000 really good manufacturing jobs, and a model for how we can not only reduce the amount of trees cut down, but we can reward the people who are too invisible for the work they're doing to not cut down those trees. And so we're starting to see that market, and that is inspiring a biodiversity credit market, which is super new, but it's the beginning of putting monetary value on what an economist would call the externalities, the environmental or the social impact that a company creates, and integrate it into how we actually value that company. When it gets really real is when you sit with the customers, the people the women, like this woman I just met named Batul, just like 3 months ago. And she talked about what it was like selling chapati, which are like flatbread, fried flatbread on her stoves, that she would sit in this little tiny shop, and it was so smoky she could only stay there for about 4 hours. And first she had to go find wood for 2 hours, and then she would keep it open for 4 hours. Well, now there's no smoke in her shop. She has 4 stoves cooking. She's WhatsApping people all over the neighborhood and in the construction sites. So there was a long line outside of her store, and she keeps it open 10 hours a day because she doesn't have all that smoke inhalation. That sense of pride, the release of other entrepreneurship, and the good that one company has done is where you start to see how we can address some of these big changes that have such macro impacts at a micro level, but imagine what it looks like to take it across the world.
You know, I was another fellow board member and partner, Andrea Soros. She had this amazing quote once that said, "What started with a single investment has grown by finding the edge of what is reasonably possible and then pushing that edge through constant learning, partnership, and a willingness to accept risk because the rewards are so important." You know, what is the cost of not doing it? And then also, when you go to a place like Burn or Delight, it's a story that sounds so successful in some ways now when we can talk about it, and the journey to get there is so hard. And I still remember when you met with the person who was questioning all kinds of, why are you working with the poor? The return has to be so much higher. Why are we? It was so amazing when your response was, I don't want to be at that table. I want to be at a different table where people talk about different things and actually measure differently and measure what matters, not only what can be counted. And I think whether it's the FICO score or whether it's being at this table or another table, there is a way that these companies, as they succeed, begin to teach us what actually matters, because they allow the people who are benefiting from the services to have a really strong input in where the business should go. And so when we visited Burn in the fall, I guess, in Africa, and you could see the R&D dollars were being used for things that were really now like maybe a pressure cooker. It may not work, but it might work. And wouldn't that be amazing? Because people would save time on cooking, or 4 different sizes of cook stoves, and the company, for someone who visits public companies on a regular basis, the company's factories and the way that they're functioning and the 3D printing and what they're using now, it's so different from the hopelessness we felt talking to them just a number of years ago when, before carbon credits came into the market, they could have gone under. But really, all of these businesses, they're so hard to get there, but they can really change the reality for people on the ground. And the exhibition shows you that you start to change things like that. You can actually have a completely different outlook longer term and reimagine the future. But there's a lot of work that goes into it, and you have to tolerate and be patient those failures along the way. And think of the humans involved, this design.
And Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. And part of taking that risk is showing that the normalization of it. And Jacqueline, you talked about what customers actually want, and Shaiza, you talked about building businesses around what customers want. And so I think it's really helpful to highlight, why does the data show us anyone takes climate action? Why does anyone buy an EV? Why does anyone get an induction stove? Why does anyone put solar on their rooftop? And RARE, which is a behavioral economics climate research institution, found that, does it matter whether you believe in climate change or not? Does that affect whether you take climate action? No. There are a lot of people out there who believe climate change is real, and they're not taking any action. Then they looked at, in America, does it matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican? And they found out that's predictive of whether you believe in climate change, but it's not predictive of whether you take climate action. The number one thing that predicts whether people take climate action is if they see everyone around them is doing it too. That we only do it because we want to be a part of something. And in a dark time in the world, what we're often missing is a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of safety, and doing things together allows us those feelings. And so I think too often we drive forward with either business-only solutions or policy-only solutions in climate, when we need both. Like, our business of getting low-income households solar got infinitely easier with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We are still able to grow in states across the country. We are still able to sign up low-income customers. But the fact of the matter is, when the government says, this is a mandate, we have to make sure clean energy is a human right, and we have to make sure that everyone gets equitable benefits from the clean energy transition, because we know that climate solutions are the driver of the greatest economic transformation this country will see in the next decade. All of that matters. All of that builds on each other. Isaac Newton said, if I have seen farther, it's because I stood on the shoulder of giants. And this normalization, the taking of risk, allows us to stand on each other's shoulders, and only then can we actually impact climate.
Steph, it's so interesting, and you talked about the United States. I wonder if you went to the poor in the developing world, if you would hear different answers, because what I'm always increasingly impressed by is the awareness of poor farmers, poor slum dwellers, that their lives are fundamentally changed because of climate change. And they're making decisions that are climate smart for survival. But they're using the language of climate change. Last year, when I was in Kenya, drought was so bad that many of our companies were at risk of bankruptcy because low-income people just couldn't pay for what they were buying. This year, the floods were so dramatic that not only did we see houses get swept away, and unlike here, often people have insurance or find ways of rebuilding their houses. These houses were just gone. And so talking to some of the farmers who are so intelligent and grounded in the realities of climate change and how it's impacting them harder than anyone in the world, though they have contributed the least, is incredibly humbling. But on the other side of it, right on the other side of it, are the stories of what it actually means when a company does take the risk, does provide a hedge or an edge for low-income people. We have a company called FarmWorks that is working with low-income farmers to move them into regenerative ag, which, as you know, Shaiza, doesn't happen overnight. But the company can hold that risk, train the farmers, find markets for them so that the farmers can earn more income as they use agricultural techniques that are both more productive and better for the earth. And I got to talk to these two women who are old friends, and one was much older, named Faith, and the younger one was named Sarah. And I was asking them, did this company really help you? And I was sort of egging them on, and they were like, yes, yes, yes. And then the older one said, you know, I used to live in poverty, and now I don't. And I said, that's such an interesting thing for a poor person to say, that I used to live in poverty and now I don't. I said, can you tell me what it was like to move from living in poverty to crossing the line into not? And she said, you know, I don't know if there's a line, but when you live in poverty, you wake up in the morning and all you feel is stress. You don't know if you have enough money for the bus, for the school fees, even to feed your children. And now I wake in the morning and I can think about how to plan my day. And I know my children are safe. And I can even sometimes dream about buying a new dress. I said, so what's that feel like? And she said, to me, that feels like freedom. What we have and what I felt when I sat in the room with the floods upstairs, and I thought about the floods that we've just experienced in so many parts of the world, with the vulnerability and the fragility of low-income people, is that right on the other side of that is the possibility of freedom and choice and dignity. And that is what we all need to be rethinking as we consider the system and our possibilities to change the system, because at the end of the day, especially in a room like this, we are that system.
And another reason why I think that everyone has a role to play, the coal pictures reminded me of this story of 1958 in Nova Scotia. There was a coal mine explosion that collapsed one of the deepest coal mines in the world of 12,000 feet. And there were a group of these coal miners stuck at the bottom of the coal mine. And the people that emerged as leaders initially were these strong men. They didn't have that many friends in the group. And they got all the water and food, and they got everyone together. And they even forced people to start to drink their own urine and eat coal, which was credited later with helping with their survival.
Wow.
But after a few days, the lights turned out, and they all sat in darkness, and the different type of leader emerged in this moment. It was the person that could sit in complete darkness, 12,000 feet below the surface, and not freak out. It was the person that could get through that and calm everyone down and remind them that help was on the way. And meanwhile, the other coal miners that survived were digging from the surface. They were taking shifts, each person going 3 to 4 minutes at a time to save their brethren, because the coal miners' role of code of ethics was no one was going to be left down there if there was any possibility that they could rescue their coworker. And so, as it turned out, they did a study of the coal miners. They got out after about a week, and they found that no person was the leader in both those situations. That you needed different leaders in different moments at different times, and that was the only reason this group of people survived. You had the strong men, and then you had the second leader that was incredibly empathetic, incredibly considerate,
And able to hold community.
and able to hold community. And so when we talk about the equitable climate world, the future that we need is everyone's business. Like, everyone has a role to play in that way. We need all leaders of all types. And so I'd invite everyone here to, and I know a lot of people are already working on this problem, but if you aren't, there is a role for you to play, just like we definitely need different types of leaders on this team.
And it's amazing, partly looking at, it's not just an investment fund in Acumen. Many of the people, whether there were fellows who, you went from Pakistan as an intern to India as a fellow working at D-Light, really got to see on the ground all kinds of real situations of what happens when you don't have light and what happens when you then have access to off-grid energy. But I feel like in serving on the investment committee for Africa, I saw the pipeline of how many entrepreneurs there are on these different continents who have ideas, who have businesses, who are working toward it. And there's so many that don't make the papers and they don't make the news, and we don't really know about what's happening there. And then there's the idea that Acumen Academy has, like, I took storytelling for change and took human-centered design and canvassing to understand the markets of the poor. All of those help me so much in my daily life at work, with my friends, with situations I encounter. And I think there are ways where there's such a big tent that everybody can actually come under, whether you're, and that's what I loved about Acumen, because I came home really sad from Asia in many ways, and I read it and I looked at what was happening at Acumen. It was something I wanted to be a part of because I knew that it was full of possibility and the future could be different. And I want to take enough time to make sure that people get their questions answered too, because I'm sure they have many questions for both of you. But maybe we could just take 1 minute and think about, for each of us in the audience, Susan's question of what do I have to offer? And just take a minute to turn to the person next to you and talk about it. And then we can go into Q&A, and I would love to just have as many voices as possible enter the conversation, because it is about community, and we're here, and we can do something. And I think Coal and Ice wasn't about piling on the difficulty, but about catalyzing the change. Let's take a minute to do that. So I'm glad that everyone had so much to say just from the volume. It was fun. And it would be wonderful to get your questions and to hear what's on your mind, and just we have a good amount of time just to be able to include people in the room. So there are mics that are going around, and just let us know your name and who you are and anything that we need to know, and ask us anything you need. Right there.
I think I see Malik.
Malik, yeah. Thank you, Malik.
Hello. Hi. My name is Kyle. I teach philosophy down the street at Hunter College, and one sort of topic I'm really interested in here is climate change adaptation. And it's not that there's too much discussion of mitigation, it's just there's also not enough discussion of adapting to climate change. And so I was hoping to hear from all of you. By the way, thank you so much for everything you said. But I was hoping to hear from all of you about how you think about adaptation efforts and adaptation planning in your work, and what challenges and what opportunities are there for adapting to climate change, in addition to the mitigation work that you're supporting.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Adaptation requires us to reckon with the fact that we are already blowing past what the climate agreement said we should stick to, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we don't have enough solutions around adaptation, primarily because it revolves around making sure the people that are most affected by climate change, which is the global south, low-income folks that didn't create climate change, are able to survive, but they don't lack the resources to do that. And so what we're really talking about is a redistribution of wealth and a redistribution of value, which is what is required through policy change, because this is a market failure. You know, we've had every year the amount of billions increases to trillions in terms of the damages from natural disasters we're seeing. And we will see more coastal flooding And we will see more island nations, I'm from an island nations disappear. And the only way that we can actually prepare for that future is if we create pathways for folks who didn't create the climate change issue to get resources to protect against that. It's the reality we live in. Have been very involved in policy since I worked in the US government in the Obama administration, and I was just at a conference last weekend trying to create, if the Democrats do win again, what is the second term critical policy drivers that we need to focus on? And everyone in the room said, we don't have the big idea for adaptation. We have a lot that we're working on for mitigation, but not yet adaptation. And so that's what we need. A century ago, almost a century ago, the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, who was sitting in a fascist prison, and he wrote that the crisis of the moment comes from the fact that the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. And it's in that kind of interstitial space where you see a myriad of morbid symptoms occur. And so that is what we need. We need more people thinking about adaptation solutions. We need the wealthier countries to follow their commitments to create a fund for the global south to be able to create more adaptation mechanisms and solutions. We don't have that yet, and so that is an area that we need more help on, very frankly.
I agree with everything that Steph said so beautifully, and your framework is so wonderful, Steph. Almost all the work we do in energy is adaptation. All the work we do in agriculture is focused on adaptation, and that's for a very simple reason. We're focused on smallholder farmers, and so to enable them to actually succeed in agriculture means you have to help them adapt to the changing climate. And that also means two things: new business models that put the farmer at the center, on the one hand, and new capital models that have the willingness to integrate the costs of adaptation into what it actually takes to make these businesses work. So our first fund, the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, has a 50% first loss layer. So banks can come in, but they can lose half the money before the banks that come in on top lose their money. And on the side is the recognition that you also need grant money for technical assistance. So we can construct these capital instruments to enable companies like Ethio Chicken, which doesn't sound like adaptation right away, but give me a minute, to succeed. So Ethio Chicken had the insight in Ethiopia that when there's a drought, very, very poor farmers, and Ethiopia is a country where the average household earns $350 a year, people will sell their goats, or if they're rich enough to have a cow, which is unlikely, and get chickens. Because chickens are foragers. They'll eat anything off the ground. They're sources of daily protein through the eggs, and they're ways to have movable wealth. And so when these two guys decided they were going to start a chicken company in Ethiopia, there was no real industry. The average Ethiopian ate about a half a kilo of chicken per year. They put the farmer at the center, they restructured the business model, and they grew that company. We used our patient capital to allow them to try, fail, try again, and then the fund to support them on top of that. It's a long story, but where again, I've seen the power of that entrepreneurship from the bottom up that puts humans and the earth at the center and builds from that perspective. Last year, that company sold 43 million chickens to 16,000 agents and 3.5 million farmers whose chickens made 3.5 billion eggs and pumped about $800 million into the economy. Adaptation for a smallholder farmer means more income. because that income gives you the freedom to make decisions that keep your family a little bit safer. And so we have to start thinking about adaptation in fundamentally different ways as well. And what I'm really excited about is Malik Sarwar, who's sitting next to you, is that we're now creating the first climate vehicle in the history of Pakistan to bring that kind of thinking and adaptive approach into a country that has 250 million people and contributes less than 3% to emissions, and the level of poverty is growing. A few months ago in Karachi, the temperatures reached 147 degrees. Adaptation. Think about those people carrying bricks on their heads, working in the fields, no electricity, no fans. We got a problem that coal and ice is showing, and there's a new generation that are recognizing that we need the best of our people across the world to focus on the solutions.
And there were 100 reasons over the course of my connection with Acumen for Acumen to leave Pakistan. But the commitment there was so deep. And when you see the way that the money now has been raised in order to go into Pakistan and have a woman who's going to be leading a fund there to think about climate change and actually fund businesses that are going to be incredible laboratories and experiments to think about how you can deal with mitigation and adaptation in this area is just unbelievable. And there are a lot of people here who might be great speakers in your class also in the audience where, as I mentioned, Anna is here and she has lots of ideas and would be wonderful. Dylan Hickson, a friend of mine. It's almost like a salon. I can see so many friends of mine who are here who actually could also answer that question. So I have to connect you, which is so nice.
Just a question, yeah. So Malik Sarwar,
Yeah, I'm Malik.
you mentioned Delight, which is a huge success, and this Chicken Mania, which is a success. Have there been other initiatives that looked really great and should have succeeded and they didn't? Why, and what lessons did you learn that applied to the next?
A lot.
Many.
Pardon?
So many.
So many. Well, Louis Bornstein was here before, and he was at the Gates Foundation when Gates first supported our work in water. Steph before said that one of the last things people will stop paying for are their utilities. When people have electricity, they value it so deeply, not only for the light, but for the connection to a cell phone and to the feeling of safety they have for the first time in their lives. Not so much with water. Many of low-income people around the world believe that water comes from God. God will decide whether I get sick or not. And so we learned through a company called Water Health International how tricky it was to build a private sector company that was providing essentially a public good to very poor people who had some sort of access, even if it was for very dirty water. The first people, when they would buy the water, would often give it to their livestock before they would give it to their families. Susan actually photographed this company. At the height of its success, it was serving about 10 million people, but there was a lot of subsidy built into the model, primarily through corporates. And when there's that much subsidy that's not integrated into the actual business model, it makes the company quite shaky, and so it didn't succeed. We've had companies with amazing business plans, Malik, and I think the most heartbreaking, sometimes it feels like betrayal, heartbreaking failures are due to a lack of character from the entrepreneurs that somehow see an organization like Acumen and think that our capital is easy capital or even stupid capital. It's patient capital, but trust me, it is not stupid capital, nor is it easy capital. And we'll take people to court and And we want to show the world that we are willing to do the right thing, not the easy thing, and that this stuff really matters. But we have had some cases, not so much of late, where we've made bets on the wrong character, and I think that's in part why this book and the work we do with Acumen Academy in really emphasizing the tools of moral leadership, which should not be confused with righteous leadership. It's a moral leadership that means I think about others before self, the we before I, the willingness to hold opposing ideas in tension, not just profit and purpose, but the collective and the individual, the hard and the soft, the poetic and the prose. Leadership in an interdependent world means building in ways that insist upon integrating the overlooked and underestimated, and that is not easy. And it's getting harder. And climate change is making it not only harder, but more imperative. And so finding the right business model is not as important as finding the right character. When you find the right business model and the right character, and you can put the capital in for long enough, magic is possible.
And why the patient capital is so important is, this is not that public now, but a lot of climate tech businesses have gone out of business this year, not because they didn't have a good product, not because they didn't have customers who wanted to buy what they wanted, but because they just couldn't raise in what people call the most difficult year to raise since before the financial crisis in 2008. And climate tech businesses are unique in that you can't just create a great product. You have to create entire ecosystems around that product. You have to create financing and distribution capacity. And when I was working at D-Light in rural villages in India, I had to take a plane, then I had to get a train for a few hours, and I had to drive overnight to get to these places where customers wanted to buy solar lanterns, but we had to build out the distribution network to get to them. It takes, the truth of the matter is the line between a successful business and an unsuccessful business is much thinner than people think. And Solstice was acquired a couple years ago, and by all accounts, people, especially our investors, say that's a successful business. I got my return, and yet we could have gone out of business. We were very close to going out of business, probably 4 times. I once had to put my life savings so that I could make payroll and not lay people off. And you have to get through that moment to get to the other side, but what if you couldn't get through that moment? And the thing that got us through those moments was not financial capital, which we put the most emphasis on. It was social capital, which Jacqueline and Shaiza talk about all the time. People came in and they saved us, and they had allowed us to get to this place where we could actually be considered a successful business. So the difference between an unsuccessful business and a successful one is social capital, and even then, it might not work out. So that's the importance of the community and making sure that these climate solutions actually see the light of day. The last thing I'll say real quick is looking back on every single energy technology that became mainstream. When you look at coal, when you look at oil, when you look at natural gas, it took 60 years for each of those technologies to become adopted as the mainstream.
And a lot of subsidy.
A lot of subsidies. Even today, there's still $2 trillion of subsidies to fossil fuel companies every year globally. And it took a lot of subsidy, it took a lot of time, and we simply don't have that time right now. We have to get to mainstream renewable energy and adaptation solutions like crop-resistant, drought-resistant crops and flood-resistant crops. We have to get to that in the next decade.
Pest-resistant crops.
Thank you, yes. And so that is what we're talking about. We could have so many more successful businesses if everyone got on board with creating the solutions.
This might feel like an adjacency, but it's when I'm listening to Steph and I'm looking at the two of you, and I can't see as many people as Shaiza can, but I know you're there. And I think about coal and ice and the story of climate and the story of poverty and the story of us. A word we're too often afraid of using, or we overuse it, is love. And I truly think that at the heart of so much of what we're talking about is grounded in love for the planet, love for each other, and the kind of love that recognizes that we're all connected, we're all related. And we don't use the language anymore of we're all brothers and sisters, but maybe we need to bring that language back a little bit. But when you talk about social capital, you're also saying that people came forward who loved you and who loved the idea that you were working on with everything that you had. And in seeing you succeed, they got to feel that they were a little bit part of it. And somehow we're missing those stories as we get afraid of each other and pull into ourselves at the very moment where we should be expanding ourselves and reaching outward.
It is such a, I mean, the entrepreneurs, it's such a lonely experience at times. So that's also why I think so much of the community is critical. Is there someone in the front? Oh no, I'm sorry, you have right there, sorry.
Hi, my name is Mustafa. I grew up in Pakistan, and I'm an incoming MBA student at Columbia Business School. And the exhibit upstairs on flooding was really moving because it reminded me of how floods in Pakistan kind of happen every few years. There's a cyclicality, but there's also cyclicality in how the entire community mobilizes to react to those floods in terms of providing aid. And Pakistan is sort of unique in that it has one of the highest levels of poverty, but also has the highest level of individual donation per capita. But that also comes as a sort of, with its inefficiency, where a lot of it is reactive but not proactive. So in what ways do you think that some of this micro-philanthropy money can be mobilized as patient capital or as more proactive capital as opposed to reactive capital?
That's an awesome question. Pakistan raises more than $1 billion a year in philanthropy. And partially that is from the tradition of zakat, or giving 2.5% of your net worth, or your total worth, depending on how you define it, to the poor. And it is beautiful. And as you said, it often can be seen as pure charity. There are some organizations, and Acumen Fellow is part of an organization in Pakistan called Howe Co, which does provide microloans to people at 0% interest. And it has amassed hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone to people who've repaid pretty much at 100% repayment rate. And so part of the charitable donations have been used to cover the costs. And so I do think we're starting to see those models. But we're also seeing, again, a new generation of entrepreneurs for fairly small amounts of money, building completely new systems for the way that we think about how we solve these big problems. Healthcare is not often connected to climate crisis, and yet 147 degrees, floods, full-on dehydration, all of that's health, cholera outbreaks. We have a fellow in Pakistan named Sarah Said Khurram, and she's a doctor. And when she, like many peers, her parents educated her, and we're very proud that she was a doctor, in part because she would marry a really good man. And the expectation was when she had her baby, like many women doctors in Pakistan, she would stop working. And I don't know if it was from having to stop working for tradition in her family or just postpartum, but she had it bad. And she started to think about the data and realized that 70% of female doctors in her own country stopped working after they had their first child. And so how do you take that asset? It's all around us. And how do you turn that to solve a problem, which is that rural women need healthcare more than ever, and most of them will only go to see a female doctor. And so she built a very rudimentary, now sophisticated, telemedicine network that started off doing very well using individual clinics, and during COVID that all went away, and so she built an app which today has reached about 6 million low-income women, mobilizing tens of thousands of female doctors, not only in Pakistan, but during COVID around the world. She got the government to accept Pakistani doctors who spoke different languages with US, New Zealand, Australian licenses, which is a pretty radical step for a government to take. What can I offer? And one of my favorite stories was when she told the story of a woman in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is way in the north of Pakistan. People speak Pashtun, which is not spoken by many people inside of Pakistan. The woman had eclampsia in the middle of the night in Pakistan, but it was the middle of the day in Manhattan. And so she went on the app. A New York City-based Pakistani doctor who spoke Pashtun got on the app, told her and her husband what to do, talked her through, and saved that child. When you start to imagine innovation that's happening at the edges due to necessity, based on network distributed systems, which are the only kinds of systems that really will, I believe, endure in a world of climate change where so much is changing all the time. And you realize, how do we mobilize human beings, not just in front of us, but even on the other side of the world? Then we've got something where we can all be part of a global community that isn't disconnected, nor at a place where our elites are all just together but not connected to the poor in our own countries, but where we truly see each other as part of the problem and part of the solution. And again, it's somewhat tangential, but I think healthcare and climate are going to be increasingly interlinked.
And it's worth visiting the projects in Pakistan. So next time you go home, you may want to visit some of the Acumen projects. Kathy? Or, sorry,
Is there
someone
time
has
for
a
one more
mic
question?
next. Yeah.
Hi,
Hey,
I'm Anna.
That's Anna.
The Anna she's been mentioning. How can I not ask a question?
That's a good point. I think she was putting
Thank you.
pressure on you.
I'm Anna Porzakansky from the American Museum of Natural History. It's been really thought-provoking and lovely conversation. Thank you so much. I wanted to talk to, but first of all, I want to share one thing, which is I want to add to the very good question, what can we contribute? Another question I've been asking a lot, which is from the introduction of All We Can Save, the book, which is, who do I need to become? And I think that's a really good question for us to ask at multiple levels. Who do we need to become as an institution, too? As a community, too? And so those are really good questions I've been thinking about. But Steph, I loved your quote about the old, what was it, is dying, but the new is not ready to come. And one very provocative thing I've come to learn about is this idea of a triple horizon, a third horizon. So if you can imagine, the old practices or whatever it is dying, the new is not ready to be born, you have a chasm in the middle that has to be bridged somehow. And that's when you come up with short-lived strategies that will help you bridge from the old to the new. And the problem is that the old is also resisting its passage, and the status quo is fighting to stay. And so you have all described cases of things that were game changers in the past. The carbon markets coming in online. And so I would love to ask you, if you had to pick one thing that could be a game changer in the next year or two for what you're doing, that is such a leveraging point, in the system that really allows for the system to repattern, so to speak, what would it be? Thank you.
Right now, because the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of countries across the world are saying, oh, that's a good idea. That's creating a ton of jobs. It's already created 300,000 jobs in America. That's giving people good paying jobs in places like coal country in Kentucky and Georgia, where factories have closed. maybe we should do that too. And sometimes it's about spreading that contagion. You know, when we show up at people's door and we ask them, hey, can you sign up for solar? People will sign up at a 1 to 2% conversion rate, which is not enough, not fast enough. If someone hears about solar from their friend, they sign up with a 30 to 50% conversion rate. One of the things that we don't do enough is talk about climate and spread that contagion effect. It really, really does work. Like I said, the people take action because everyone around them is doing it too. We have to create that leverage point where we're seeing in every single movie and TV show, people are just normally just charging their EV and talking about solar on their house. They don't even have to talk about climate change. We just need to normalize these things. And it happens both through policy and it happens through customer adoption. I gave 2 answers, I'm sorry, not 1. But it's really about replicating the successes we see in corners of the world and spreading them like wildfire in my mind. That's the biggest leverage.
I would say almost exactly the same thing, just using a different word, which is we need a mindset shift more than anything else in terms of the way we see the earth, the way we see each other, and importantly, the way we see the poor. We also have to shift the way that we partner with each other, that we are not going to solve problems of electrification for the very poor in ways that help avert long-term climate crisis. Without government, without the private sector, and without civil society. And our sectors haven't been trained to partner with each other. We hold huge biases against each other. And yet, a lot of hope for me comes right in those interstices between the sectors, where smart people can come together and have a better understanding of how to solve these problems and then do their part and recognize that then we can actually make change. And I think it's something you've done a spectacular job of with Solstice, Steph, in terms of understanding the policy implications, knowing the customers, and then building a product that can actually meet their need. And we need more people like you.
I also think it's important to tell the stories that people are talking about, but also even the center on it, that you work with the policy changes and what you have created in the world. It has to get out into our psyche, in understanding how much good work has been done at the Tamer Institute or at so many places where there are just so many stories of change, positive change, and that shifts the mindset, and that allows us to feel the possibility and really sows the seeds of optimism, which is there also, including all the things that we've talked about that are difficult, and the exhibition points out there's so much that's happening on a specific level. And is it 8 o'clock? I'm not sure my watch is right. Okay.
It's 8.
Okay, it's 8. But I don't want to hold people longer. We're here for a little while, but it's just such a gift to be here with all of you and to think about the idea of socializing hope and going ahead. And I wanted to read the manifesto, Acumen manifesto, thanks, Henry. And then the blue sweater too. This is an incredible book of case studies, but the blue sweater was one where I sort of finished the book and I was like, wow, she could be my friend. This is amazing. Like, the book was so true to how Acumen started and what mattered there. And
Want me to get it?
it's at the beginning.
We live in a world where no one's attention span is longer than 20 seconds, so thank you all for being here with us.
Yeah, you got it.
Oh, you want me to find it?
It's in the chapter manifesto, but where is it?
These pages are just really thin.
Small.
Yeah.
Maybe you can
Here it
pull
goes.
it up on the.
Want me to read it?
Yeah, you want to?
Yeah. It starts by standing with the poor.
It's at 239.
39. It starts by standing with the poor, listening to voices unheard and recognizing potential where others see despair. It demands investing as a means, not an end, daring to go where markets have failed and aid has fallen short. It makes capital work for us, not control us. It thrives on moral imagination, the humility to see the world as it is, and the audacity to imagine what could be. It's having the ambition to learn at the edge, the wisdom to admit failure, and the courage to start again. It requires patience and kindness, resilience and grit, a hard-edged hope. It's leadership that rejects complacency, breaks through bureaucracy, and challenges corruption, doing what's right, not what's easy. It's the radical idea of creating hope in a cynical world, changing the way the world tackles poverty, and building one based on dignity.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your being here.
Thank you, everyone.